We're going to move on now and look at how question and response format can affect survey answers. A few examples of different ways that surveys can be shaped by both the response and the question format. One of the most classic examples of this also occurred in the 1964 ANNES, where at the time there appeared to be some sort of increasing ideological alignment. Basically, if you looked at the relationship or the inter-item correlations between partisanship and various political issue attitudes, and also the retest reliability of partisanship itself. So if you had a two-wave study, you would measure partisanship at one point and partisanship at a second point. It appeared those correlations were much higher. And initially, there was in fact a book published that claimed that, in essence, 1960s voters were more politically enlightened or more sophisticated. It turned out, though, that later studies revealed that, in fact, it was simply a change in the response format between 1960 and 1964. So the original question about basically, are you basically, what is your partisanship? And there had been a list of response options. Yeah, I'm a strong Democrat. No, I'm a weak Democrat. I'm an independent but I'll lean Democrat, etc. People had to answer those directly. However, the response was changed to instead be a branching form. So the first version would be, are you a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? And then once people answered that question, they'd just be asked, are you a strong or a weak Democrat? Are you an independent leaner? And it turned out that this format change was enough to actually change all of these inter-item correlations and the retest reliability. In essence, the branching version of the question was much more stable than a 7-point scale. So this gives you some example of what the actual branching version versus the non-branching version is in terms of how you would code it. One of the things is that in your group studies, you will see that it's important to have these different versions. And in fact, branching versions of all questions turn out to be more stable than non-branching. Unfortunately, they're also a little bit more difficult to program. And in some cases, they may not make as much sense to use. So in some cases, a 7-point scale, agree, disagree, is perfectly reasonable. But it's good to know that these branching versions do have a certain type of stability to them. Another example of a response format, a difference might be whether or not a middle response option is used. So are you a liberal or a conservative or middle of the road doesn't get volunteered very much, right? So whenever you sort of force the choice, people will typically choose liberal or conservative. However, whenever given the same option, are you liberal, conservative, or middle of the road, all of a sudden half of respondents choose middle of the road. So in essence, this issue of forcing the choice, like I said, a branching question, can have its good or bads. A lot of it depends also on whether or not you offer this middle option. The same with actually offering don't knows. It can have a big effect. So if you offer people don't know, they're more likely to take it than if you don't offer it. They're less likely to just volunteer it. Same issue with response options. So on a 5-point scale, right, middle of the road, actually, there aren't as many people on a 5-point scale as there are if you're liberal, conservative, middle of the road. 54% choose, but that goes down to 41% when given the choice of somewhat liberal or somewhat conservative. So sort of, again, the more that you think about this like the independents leaning Democratic or Republican, the more that you give people a little bit more choice after that initial 3 choices, they'll tend to sort of start to split themselves off more. So all of these response options, in essence, don't completely capture what people might want to say in a more open setting, but we're giving them as many responses as we think are reasonable. Another way that response options can matter is a phenomenon called anchoring. So we noticed the anchoring type of phenomenon before when we looked at things like if you had people rate, say, higher status occupations earlier or later. But another example of this might be how much TV do you watch each day? And you can see that if you give them more than 2.5 hours as the highest option, only 16% of people choose it. They don't want to think they watch the most TV of everyone else, right? So they're sort of anchored into this thinking, well, this is looking sort of normal and I'm about average, so I must be watching, say, 1.5 to 2 hours. However, if you instead sort of switch things around, where up to 2.5 hours is actually lower, and then everything above 2.5 hours goes up, then all of a sudden many more people claim to watch 2.5, say to 3 hours than originally said to watch more than 2.5 hours. So this is again, just how you actually choose these options can have a big impact on how people answer the questions. Often on these types of questions, it's good to actually get realistic distributions. So say in income, you want to have them basically correspond to something like a quartile range or something of what an actual empirical distribution might look like. So interestingly, though, there are things that can moderate this anchoring effect. So in this case, you have, for example, a low scale or a high scale, right? So where very much like the previous question we have, but this is a proportion of respondents that report eating red meat 10 times a month. And what you can see is that for these younger respondents who don't tend to eat meat all that frequently, they aren't as affected by the scales because they're a little bit more aware of how often they actually eat meat. Like it's an easier thing to calculate. For the older people who are eating meat more frequently, they in essence are more responsive to this red meat scale. Now you might think it's just a matter of age, but it turns out that other behaviors that are less frequently performed by older people, you don't have that same moderation effect. So this is an example then with headaches. So younger people are getting headaches much more often. They're much more affected by the scale categories. For older people who aren't getting headaches as often, they are not as affected really at all, right? You can see the flat line here by these headache categories. So again, you have response options matter, but who it matters to will depend a lot, to some extent at least, on how often you're performing these activities. So if they're low frequency activities, people are a little bit better able to count up and sort of come up with a reliable estimate and aren't as affected by the scale itself. So a lot of it depends on that. Another way that you could think about this is basically the ease with which you can monitor yourself. So one of the interesting results here is that basically people who monitor themselves a lot you might think of them as being less more easily able to resist the scales. People in the U.S. in general tend to have a lower self-monitoring than people in China. So people in China, particularly in public behaviors, tend to monitor themselves very much in accordance with sort of what they believe social norms are and how they should behave in public. And so what you can see is that in terms of private behaviors, people in the U.S. and China are fairly similar in how often they report these frequencies. Both of them are affected by whether it's a low or high scale. And you can see the high scale appears to be more like the open-ended choice, which in itself sort of suggests the high scale is more accurate. Interestingly enough, though, you don't find that same result in public behaviors. So here, where you have the people from China being much more likely to self-monitor their public behaviors, you see, again, no a moderation effect such that people from China are not really affected by the scale and are consistent across low, high, and open. Whereas you get this people in the U.S. for public behaviors are affected by the scale. Another way that response options might matter is because people actually interpret those response options. So imagine that how successful have you been in life so far? 0 means not successful at all, and 10 means you're extremely successful. Then 34% of people choose 0 to 5. But if you said the same thing where you say, -5 means not successful at all, and +5 means quite successful, then only 13% are choosing -5 to 0. In essence, people don't want to think of themselves as negative, that negative has meaning. It's not just pure numbers on a scale. They might be willing to say, I'm only a 0, a 1, or 2, or 3, but I haven't actually gone negative, right? So again, you've got this real interpretation of the numbers themselves that can play a role. The same type of thing can happen when you think about political attitudes. You might want to think about, for example, more conservative on the right and more liberal on the left sometimes, because if there's any type of a spatial dimension to political issues, then people might start to think in that sort of left-right term. We don't always ask the questions that way, but it's an important way that you want to think about what it means to place options, particularly in ambiguous issues. Another issue here could be open versus closed form questions, which we mentioned before. So in essence, with a closed form, when you give people their big options are high income, no danger of firing, short working hours, chance for advancement, the important work or feeling of accomplishment sort of comes in quite high, right? So it's like 60% of people are choosing this. However, whenever you give them open form and you code it, you actually see things like pleasant work, work conditions, satisfaction. These sort of go along with the idea of important work or feeling of accomplishment, but the pleasant and the work conditions are different. They don't correspond completely to what we had before. Actually, fewer people choose short hours. Chance for advancement goes way down in terms of opportunity for promotion. So for whatever reason, the closed form and open form are getting quite different answers, and it suggests that we have to be very careful in how we actually construct closed forms. They mirror what people might actually want to tell us. Otherwise, we're sort of forcing them to choose between choices that may not be entirely representative of actual sort of rationales that people might provide on their own.